is Jenny, and today I'm writing on my wall to talk to you about depression. I've had cancer, and I've had depression, and for me, the depression was worse. It was much worse. I would rather go through 20 years of chemotherapy than experience another depressive episode. That's how painful it was. So I want to tell you what some of the symptoms are of depression. In my experience, symptoms included feeling blue. This was more than just feeling sad. This was a feeling that was beyond circumstance or what you'd think would explain a feeling of sadness. I noticed this the moment I woke up in the morning, because my first thought upon entering consciousness would be, what happened yesterday? My mind would spend just a couple seconds trying to match this feeling to my situation, and it would wonder, did someone die? Did I make a horrible life-changing mistake? But there was no reason to explain why I felt this sad, this weighed down. It was like a blanket of sorrow, and things that normally brought me joy couldn't quite penetrate through that emotion. I also experienced a foggy mind. This is a very distinct sensation. It feels like your brain is in a fog. If the mind were a clock, it's as if the gears are covered in syrup. They're not turning well. I found decision-making to be very difficult. Simple decisions could sometimes stop me in my track for minutes at a time, and I just could not get my mind to work to process the decision. Another symptom is negative thoughts. If I were cooking dinner and I was in a healthy state of mind and the lid of the pepper shaker fell off and dumped a quarter cup of pepper in our dinner, I would say, ah, and I would scoop out as much as I could. My predominant emotion in response to that little catastrophe would be amusement. But if that same thing happened when I was depressed, my predominant emotion would be anger in response to that event, and my first thoughts would be, I always mess things up, or I never do anything right. The always and never statements were so common when I was depressed, and these thoughts felt just like the thoughts I normally have that I associate as being my own. So they were very difficult to recognize as a symptom of the depression. Intrusive thoughts, on the other hand, felt very different. Their tone was foreign. They felt like they came from somewhere else. They didn't sound like me. These thoughts were often homicidal or suicidal, and they were crippling. I had episodes where I was overwhelmed by these thoughts, and they came with such force and frequency that all I could do was curl up in a ball and cry. I could not sing a hymn to get them out of my mind. I could not banish them by sheer willpower. They came, and they came in force. And then the last symptom that I experienced was overpowering emotions. These were emotions of guilt and worthlessness that were crippling. And I want to draw a distinction between these first three symptoms and the last two. Sometimes all of these symptoms came together, and other times I would just have a couple. But generally, when I experienced these first three, I felt moderately depressed. I was not okay, but most of the time I could still act okay. I could feed myself, I could take care of my kids, I could talk to neighbors. But when I experienced these symptoms, this more severe depression, I could not function at all. And the pain of the overpowering emotions was the most acute pain I've ever experienced in my entire life. I honestly felt that everybody I knew or had yet to meet would be a happier person if I did not exist. It is a very hard thing to be battling both thoughts and emotions that are bent on destroying you. Depression is a serious disease, one that can be just as life-threatening as cancer. So I want to talk to you for a moment about solutions. How can you get out of this if you are troubled with depression and if your mind is not well? First, you need to identify, can you see the yellow? Kind of. Identify triggers. We'll try red. Which one will get orange? Identify triggers. Everyone probably has different triggers that bring on the symptoms of depression. When I experienced postpartum depression, I was not depressed all the time. It was a thing that came and went. My triggers were generally anxiety about a to-do list being too long. When I was depressed, I could handle one, maybe two things on my to-do list. Any more than that created a cloud of anxiety that drove me into the ground. Another trigger of mine was negative emotions. If I felt discouraged because my sink was full of dirty dishes, then I immediately, if I was depressed, I would immediately experience an increase in the severity of my symptoms. Now, it's not healthy or practical to train yourself never to experience any negative emotions, but you can do something about the sink if you know that negative emotions come in response to the sink. The next thing that you need to do is to seek things that help. Therapy can be very helpful. I was reluctant to go to a therapist because I felt like my depression was entirely pathological. I had a happy childhood, I'd never struggled with abuse, therefore I thought I would have no reason to talk to a therapist. I was wrong. My therapist was very helpful. She helped me identify triggers, cognitive behavioral therapy. She helped me to recognize these negative thoughts in my mind and ways to overcome them. And just going to therapy gave me greater willpower to do other things that helped, such as exercise. Exercise was extraordinarily helpful to me. 4 to 5 days a week of aerobic activity, at least a half hour each day, was most helpful. If I exercised once or twice a week, that wasn't enough to make a difference. For a while, I felt like I was dependent on exercise for my well-being. If I wasn't consistently walking, swimming, or biking, then I became really irritable and I was prone to slumping into a miniature relapse of depression. It bothered me a little bit that I was dependent on exercise, but what better thing to be dependent on, because every side effect is positive. You're looking at lower risk of heart disease and stroke, greater strength and endurance, fewer aches and pains, more energy overall, and sleeping better at night. So exercise can be really helpful. Community is also important. Community. I had wonderful support from my family, friends, and church group. The disease made it seem like they had disappeared. It made it seem like I was alone, but in hindsight, I can see how much they did for me. Their affirmations that the disease was not of my own invention, that I wasn't at fault because I had depression, helped a lot. Their gifts of time and service were also very helpful. We live in a society that is very over-individualistic, and we think that if you succeed, it's because you worked hard, and if you don't succeed, it's because you didn't work hard enough. That's false. And it's especially not true with depression. Nobody should be expected to overcome depression by sheer willpower. And so I hope that if you don't have a group, you can find a good group, because the mental health, the groupthink, and the strength of the group directly affect the individuals in that group. Another helpful thing for me that my community helped me do was to serve. Service is a great antidote for sadness. And depression is like the devil's counterfeit to humility. It's selfish. It turns all the attention inward. And so if you can focus your attention outward and think of other people, that will help. There were a few moments at church when I was focusing all my effort on helping another person, and I felt the depression lift. My mind became clear, the negative thoughts stopped, and the blanket of sorrow fell away, all because I was earnestly striving to help another person. It wasn't a permanent cure, but it was still wonderful to have that weight removed. Sunlight was also helpful. Sometimes when I went outside for 10 or 15 minutes, there was a noticeable lift. Personal time was helpful. Having time alone to read, to pray was sometimes helpful. And medicine can be helpful. I know people who have taken the standard antidepressants and they feel like their depression has been cured by that. I also know some people who have had really adverse reactions to that medication. I know some people who have taken homeopathic remedies and feel like their depression's been cured by that. I took a methylated form of folic acid, a magnesium supplement, fish oil, and flaxseed oil. And I think that those supplements probably did help. And then sometimes distraction can be helpful, purposeful distraction. If I could tell that there were just the beginning fleeting symptoms of a depression episode coming on, and if I was able to read a book, sometimes distracting my mind and giving it something better to think about, I could avoid an episode that way. Seeking things that help is important. Avoiding things that hurt is equally so. Stress produces anxiety, which I think always feeds into depression and makes it worse. Whatever stress you can avoid, you should. And then downers are also something to avoid. Advertising can be, most advertisements are downers because they're trying intentionally to create a sense of inferiority or sometimes and to generate a need for a product. Downers are fine when your mind is well, but when you're depressed, downers can be dangerous. So I'd avoid anything overly critical, anything violent, destructive, or cynical. Now, equally important to seeking things that help and avoiding things that hurt is to recognize that sometimes depression happens for a reason. Our emotions are valid. We tend to accept positive emotions and we want to push negative emotions under a rug, but an emotion it exists. And sometimes if you have a depression, it could be due to circumstances, and not every circumstantial depression is due to loss of life or limb. Sometimes the disappointment of a dream or the realization of a dream can cause us to experience depression. And in that case, I think it's better to treat the cause than to treat the symptoms. You know, we have a hard time recognizing how mental illness handicaps us. That's because nobody can hear these thoughts or feel these emotions but you. But a mental illness can be just as difficult, if not more difficult, than a physical illness. The brain is a marvelous and monstrous mess. It's the most amazing invention of biology, and it's an organ that can get sick, just like any other organ. Another reason that we have a difficult time recognizing the limits of a mental illness is that the mind is really special. It's the seat of our identity. It's the garden of our soul. And when that organ is sick, sometimes we need to accept that our garden may not be as fertile or well-watered for the time being as it used to be. If your garden is going through a period of intense desert heat, then you may need to make peace with not being able to harvest raspberries. You know, grow the best watermelon and okra that you can. If you're struggling with depression, I'm sorry. It's so hard. But I want you to know that you can overcome depression. You can make it through. If I had only done one of these things, I think I would still be struggling with depression today. But the combination of community, service, exercise, the supplements I took, a change in lifestyle to reduce stress, those things over time worked. I no longer struggle with depression. And so here's the writing on the wall. Recognize your limitations. Avoid things that cause stress. Seek things that help. Identify your triggers. It will be probably a long journey and it might be difficult, but I want you to know that you can make it. You can overcome depression. Now, let's see if this paint comes off. Ugh. Well, the good news is that the paint sort of comes off, mostly, or the marker comes off, but it looks like the paint does too. That's the way it goes some days.